So, hello there, we're now with Sam Irvin, the author of I Was a Teenage Monster, who is going to tell us a little bit more about himself, his life. Mr. Irvin, it's a pleasure to meet you. What's your experience with the horror industry?
Well, I was a horror kid fan from the earliest age. The first film I ever saw that was a horror film was Pit and the Pendulum with Vincent Price in 1961 when it was brand new in the theaters. And it just blew me away.
I can see that.
Yes.
You can see it in the cover there.
And then I fell in love with Hammer films and all this stuff. As a teenager, I did a fanzine called Bazaar, and I went to England a couple times when I was 17 and 18 to collect interviews with all the horror film royalty, like Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and Ingrid Pitt and everybody. And so I came to England, did all of those, and put them in my magazine. Okay, now flash forward 50 years, and I decided to collect the 35 interviews that I did into this book. And then I started writing all the introductions to the interviews to talk about how I bamboozled getting the interviews. And those were really funny stories. And then I decided, well, I better set everything up and explain my childhood as to how I became a monster kid. And so it became sort of a coming-of-age memoir / collection of interviews.
Wow. Could you give us a sneak peek about how you met some of these
Well, Christopher Lee, I wrote to him through Hammer Films, and Christopher Lee, care of Hammer Films, and I sent him a questionnaire. And he answered all the questions, and I put it in one of my early fanzines as an interview, even though it was done through the mail. Well, then when I convinced my parents to send me to England as a graduation present from high school, I immediately wrote to Christopher Lee and said, I'm coming. And he wrote back and he gave me his phone number and said, call me when you get to London and I'll take you to lunch. And so I did. Well, he said, I'm working, but come to lunch at Pinewood Studios, where he happened to be making The Man with the Golden Gun, the James Bond movie. And so...
What?
Yes. So I interviewed him with my little tape recorder over lunch, and then he took me on a private tour of all the Bond sets, and then he arranged for me to watch the shooting in the afternoon, where he was doing a scene with Roger Moore, Britt Ekland, and Hervé Villechaize in Scaramanga's lair. And at the end of the day, he asked if I wanted to hitch a ride with them in the Rolls-Royce limousine back to London, and I said, uh-huh. And so I was in the limo with Christopher Lee and Hervé Villechaize all the way back to London. And Hervé was drunk and telling stories, very provocative stories of all the trouble he'd been getting into since he'd come to London. And Christopher Lee started to giggle and laugh and get hysterical, and we were just literally doubled over, howling with laughter over these crazy stories from Hervé, all the way back to London. And up to that time, Christopher Lee, to me, was Count Dracula in a Hammer film. And to see him just howling uncontrollably with laughter, tears running down his face, was the greatest thing ever.
And all of this is I Was a Teenage Monster Hunter.
Yes.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you very much, Mr. Irvin.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's great. Thank you so much.